Hi everybody, I'm going to go ahead and just start this live. I hope I'm not muted. No. Alright, so I made a playlist of day 11, which was yesterday. No, sorry, Monday. Today's Wednesday. I need to update my George Floyd calendar. So what I went ahead and did is grabbed a couple clips covering some of the highlights from week 1 and week 2. So let's go ahead and start there. Everybody make yourselves comfortable. Don't forget to hit the like for me. Let's go ahead and get started. This first video is courtesy of Kare and it's called Week 1 of the Derek Chauvin trial. 5 important moments you might have missed. Let's go ahead and get started.
5 full days of statements, testimony, and even tears in the Derek Chauvin trial, every moment of which Kare 11's Lou Regous has watched.
Has anything been surprising to you from your perspective as a journalist and as a person who's watched every moment?
There weren't these big picture surprises, but there were a lot of smaller things that I didn't know.
Let's start with that big picture. Lou notes there was never a question the trial would review what happened, what force was used, and specifically what caused George Floyd's death. Out of the gates, one critical moment, the opening statements.
The evidence will show that Mr. Floyd died of a cardiac arrhythmia that occurred as a result of hypertension, his coronary disease, the ingestion of methamphetamine and fentanyl, and the adrenaline flowing through his body.
He did have a high amount of fentanyl in his system when he died. And so the defense in their opening statement talked about how they're going to bring in the evidence to show that that was his cause of death.
George Floyd lived for years, day in and day out, every day, with all of these conditions until the one day on May 25th, when he ended the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and that was the only day he didn't survive.
The prosecution gave an effective opening statement, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. They want the jury to remember that's the amount of time that Derek Chauvin's knee was on George Floyd's neck.
Then Lou says witnesses weighed in on what happened.
Nobody can forget the Facebook video that went viral. That was shot by a teenage girl named Darnella. Her testimony was extremely emotional.
He cried for his mom. He was in pain.
But when a 61-year-old man broke down crying on the witness stand and they had to take a break during court, I mean, that was perhaps the most emotional moment of the first week.
Then Lou notes the trial turned more investigative, with 2 different MPD supervisors giving their profound perspectives.
If your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
The statements by Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman concerning him thinking it was an improper use of force were very blunt and very directed at the jury.
And finally, Lou says a moment of prosecutor-intended humanity was one to remember.
One other witness that they had that was very emotional was George Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross.
Floyd and I both suffered with the opioid addiction.
She talked about how each of them had injuries and got addicted to painkillers. And then the addiction of painkillers leads to getting drugs illegally on the street. And it's a story of addiction.
5 full days of moments. Now we brace for more.
This is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
So any expectation for what's to come?
Don't underestimate how important the medical evidence is for both sides. That's where the case is going to be won and lost.
And once again, it's critical to note that this week was the prosecution's turn to prove their case. Lou and legal analysts note the defense did make a couple of very important points in cross-examination, but their turn is still to come.
Okay, that was a clip showing some of the highlights from week 1. They didn't mention the guy that spotted the counterfeit $20 bill, or the girl that was very nervous that first day, and the fish killer. They left them out, but we remember. So we're going to continue on with some key moments of the Derek Chauvin trial in week 2. And this is courtesy of Good Morning America, and then we will move on to day 11.
Are your sneezes putting your friends in awkward positions? Stick with Zyrtec. Zyrtec starts.
Derek Chauvin and his trial, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with killing George Floyd, week 2 of testimony wrapping up with the medical examiner on the stand revealing critical details about how he said Floyd died. ABC's Rena Roy has more from Minneapolis. Rena, good morning.
Eva, good morning to you. This week was all about cause of death and use of force. As you said, experts explaining in painful detail about exactly how they believe George Floyd died.
Week 2 in the closely watched murder trial of Derek Chauvin ending with a bang. Jurors hearing highly anticipated testimony from Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner who performed George Floyd's autopsy, saying his body just couldn't handle the restraint from officers.
The law enforcement subdual restraint and the neck compression was just more than Mr. Floyd could take by virtue of those heart conditions.
The prosecution hoping to convince the jury it was Chauvin's knee that killed Floyd, but the defense says those heart problems and Floyd's drug use ultimately led to his death.
And so in your opinion, both the heart disease as well as the history of hypertension and the drugs that were in his system played a role in Mr. Floyd's death?
In my opinion, yes.
Other key medical experts also taking the stand, including pathologist Dr. Lindsay Thomas.
There's no evidence to suggest he would have died that night, except for the interactions with law enforcement.
The jury shown these 3D images as breathing and lung expert Dr. Martin Tobin asked them to feel their own necks.
This is your windpipe here.
Explaining how Chauvin's actions made it impossible for Floyd to breathe, with Floyd's body pressed against the pavement, handcuffs on in the prone position, and Chauvin's knee on his neck, back, torso, and arm.
The cause of death is a low level of oxygen.
11 current and former law enforcement officials testified against Chauvin this week, including use of force expert Jody Steiger of the LAPD, saying he should have reduced restraint and given medical aid once Floyd was cuffed on the ground.
He was not attempting to assault the officers, kick, punch, or anything of that nature.
The Minneapolis police chief also condemning his actions.
It's not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
The defense arguing the growing crowd of bystanders distracted officers, pressing Officer Nicole McKenzie on the issue.
Have you ever had to perform emergency services in not even a hostile crowd, just a loud, excited crowd?
Yes.
Is that, in your experience, more or less difficult?
It's incredibly difficult.
Prosecutors only have to show that Chauvin's actions were a substantial causal factor, even if other issues contributed to Floyd's death, according to Minnesota guidelines.
And Friday was the first time we saw someone sitting behind Chauvin in court to show support. His attorneys will soon get their chance to call witnesses. Dan?
So many people watching this trial so closely. Rena, thank you.
Okay, so that was the highlights from week 2. So now we're going to go ahead and jump into day 11, which is the beginning of week 3. The first, what I wanted to mention real quick is when trial started, the Daunte Wright shooting had already happened. So then there was some questions about whether they should continue court for Derek Chauvin because in light of this. So the first couple of news clips that we're going to watch are going to be related to that. So the first one that we're going to watch is called Chauvin Attorney Asked for Jury Sequestration. That's what he wanted. In wake of Daunte Wright shooting, and Judge Cahill denies. And this is courtesy of Kare 11.
The shooting of Daunte Wright by a police officer in Brooklyn Center came at a time when police use of force in the death of George Floyd is on trial. Tonight, a vigil is taking place to honor Daunte's life and show support for the family he left behind. But to talk about how that shooting became an issue in the courtroom this morning, let's go to Sharon.
Before the first day of the third week of the Derek Chauvin murder trial began, defense attorney Eric Nelson brought up a similar motion this morning.
Your Honor, at this time I am requesting, again, sequestration of the jury in view of the incidents of last night. As the court, I'm sure, is aware, an officer-involved shooting took place in the city of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota.
Nelson argued that not only is one juror a resident of Brooklyn Center, but that the civil unrest that followed last night's events will evoke certain emotions in the jurors.
I understand it's not this case. I understand that it does not involve these same parties. But the problem is that the emotional response that case creates sets the stage for a jury to say, I'm not going to vote not guilty because I'm concerned about the outcome.
Nelson also asked for further voir dire or questioning of the jurors again regarding whether they've seen or heard anything about the Brooklyn Center incident. He also asked the judge to tell them at the beginning and end of each day to avoid any and all media, something the state argued is near impossible.
What does avoid all media mean? Years ago, it used to mean don't read the newspaper, don't watch TV. It means something different now, I suppose. Media comes at us in all different forms. I think it'd be very difficult to follow an order to avoid all media.
Prosecution Stephen Schlischer says sequestering the jury wouldn't make a difference as world events are unavoidable.
Things continue to happen in the state, despite the fact that we're all here in trial. That's just what happens. And we can't have every single world event that might affect somebody's attitude or emotional state or anything be the grounds to come back and re-voir dire all the jurors.
Judge Peter Cahill agreed, adding that he initially brought up the possibility of a mid-trial jury sequestration specifically for the sake of jury safety and tamper protection.
The concern there was that despite keeping jurors anonymous, that somebody may find out who one of the jurors is and reach out and have an inappropriate attempt to tamper with the jury. We have no indication that that's happened in this case.
He added that a sequestration might bring even more attention to the Brooklyn Center incident to the jury.
But I think sequestering them would only aggravate that. Oh, I heard about the civil unrest and now the judge is putting us into sequestration. There must be a greater threat to our security. I think the better way is to just continue with the trial as we've been going. That's a separate issue. They should treat it as such. It'd be a different story if it was civil unrest following another verdict.
I'm not really sure what the difference would be between civil unrest after a verdict or during a trial. I could understand protecting the jury. I don't know if sequestration would be the right thing to do, although I thought they already were sequestered. I'm not too sure what they mean by that, putting them on an island or what. But yeah, so I have one more clip about about the case before the actual witnesses start taking the stand. The next video is called Derek Chauvin Trial. Judge Tells Jury State Will Rest Its Case Tuesday. And that's courtesy of Kare Levitt.
Well, Julie, this Brooklyn Center incident came up almost immediately this morning before the jurors were brought in for this 11th day of testimony in the Derek Chauvin trial. And defense attorney Eric Nelson again asked the judge if the jurors could be sequestered through the duration of the rest of the trial, saying that if they're able to go home and come back each morning, they could be exposed to media coverage that could make them biased in the Chauvin case. However, the prosecution strongly disagreed with that, saying it's a totally different case at a different department, and Judge Cahill sided with the state, denying the defense's motion.
And I realize there's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that. The reason why in my initial order, I said we're not going to sequester, but we might go to it in the middle of trial if, and the concern there was that despite keeping jurors anonymous, that somebody may find out who one of the jurors is and reach out and have an inappropriate attempt to tamper with the jury. We have no indication that that's happened.
When testimony continued in the afternoon, we heard from George Floyd's brother, Philones Floyd, a spark of life witness who appears as a way to humanize the victim for jurors, something that is allowed in the state of Minnesota. So the jury saw photos of George Floyd at a young age, through high school and even into college.
George, he would always be up on our mom. He was a big mama's boy. I cry a lot, but George, he loved his mom. He will always just be up on her. And, every mother loves all of her kids, but it was so unique how they were with each other.
And tomorrow we move into a new phase of the trial when the defense is expected to call witnesses. We anticipate that closing arguments in this case will be set a week from today, next Monday. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, Danny. And you can watch.
All right, so what he was talking about right there is actually going to be this week. So this was Monday, and the witnesses that took the stand on this day were still for the prosecution, and the prosecution rested at the end of Monday, and then on Tuesday, the defense started their case, and they're scheduled to be done before the weekend. So we're going to see how that goes, because this trial is expected to take 4 weeks, and it looks like it's only going to take 3. And it doesn't sound like Derek Chauvin is going to take the stand from what I understand so far. So let's go ahead and move on with that. Oh yeah, so right now we just heard about the Spark of Life testimony by Philones Floyd. I went ahead and found a 15-minute video of that. I am not positive if this is all of his testimony. I hope it is, but I decided that instead of just finding clips of that, since it seems like he might be the only one that came through to do the Spark of Life testimony for George Floyd, that we would watch the whole thing in its entirety if it turns out to be this 15 minutes. If it's not, I do apologize. I will let you know if there's somewhere where you could find the whole thing if this turns out not to be it. So it's called George Floyd's Brother, Philones Floyd Testifies in Derek Chauvin Trial, and this is courtesy of Kare Levin.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sir, you're here to testify about your brother, George Floyd. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And before you tell the jury about your brother, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the jury a little bit so they know something about you. How old are you?
39.
Was George your older or younger brother?
He was my oldest brother.
Are you married?
Yes, sir.
And do you have children?
Yes, sir.
How many children do you have?
2.
And sir, what state do you live in?
Houston, Texas.
I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about your brother, George Floyd. First, can you tell the jury where and when he was born?
He was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, but he left at a young age. We moved to Houston, Texas, and I have 2 other sisters that are older than us. It's Jaja Floyd, Latanya Floyd, then became George Floyd, and I'm next Philones Floyd, and my other brother Rodney Floyd, who's my mom's baby boy.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
And was he born on October 14, 1973?
Yes, sir.
And you said that the family left Fayetteville shortly after he was born. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you all grew up in Houston together.
We all grew up in Houston.
Who were George's parents?
Lasinia Jones Floyd, and his father was George Perry Floyd Sr.
And did Lasinia, is that your mother?
That's my mother, but they called her Miss Sissy.
Miss Sissy.
Yes. Sir.
Who called her Miss Sissy?
Everybody called her Miss Sissy. We just called her Mom, but everybody around the neighborhood called her Miss Sissy. Anybody that knew her called her that, and that was that. They had to be like 50 years of age, but everybody younger than that called her Mom. That was George's age. Everybody called her Mom because she was a mom to so many people in the community.
What community was that?
That was in 3rd Ward, and I grew up in the CUNY Home Housing Authority projects. It was low income poverty. So we stayed with each other all the time. Me and George, we grew up together playing video games a lot. His favorite game was on Nintendo. We played Double Dribble and we played Tecmo Bowl. And I finally beat him in a game, and I was just so happy just thinking about that. And he reset the game and would say, "Come on, let's play again." And I'd be like, "No, I gotta go do our chores now. Let me do my chores." But George also, he used to make the best banana mayonnaise sandwiches, and he used to make syrup sandwiches because George couldn't cook, he couldn't boil water. So, and also if you all were there in our house, you'll see George had lines on the wall because he will always measure with his height, trying to see how tall he is because he wanted to be taller all the time because he loved sports. So he always wanted to be the best. And
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. I appreciate you sharing that with us. I'd like to show the witness what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 284. Do you recognize the picture in 284?
Yes, sir.
Is that a picture of your mother and George when he was younger?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to offer Exhibit 284.
284 is received.
Permission to publish. Sir, would you please describe this photo and what you know about it?
That's my mother. She's no longer with us right now, but that's my oldest brother, George. I miss both of them. They are. I was married. In May 24th, I got married. And my brother was killed May 25th. And my mom died on May 30th. So it's like a bittersweet month because I'm supposed to be happy when that month comes.
Sir, I'm going to ask you some questions about your mom's passing a little bit. If you need a moment, I can take a minute and just let me know when you're ready. Oh, going back to growing up in the CUNY homes, can you please tell the jury what role George Floyd had as the older brother in that household?
He was so much of a leader to us in the household. He will always make sure that we had our clothes for school. He made sure that we all were going to be to school on time. And like I told you, George couldn't cook, but he'll make sure you have a snack or something to get in the morning. But he was one of those people in the community that when they had church outside, people would attend church just because he was there. Nobody would go out there until they seen him. And he just was like a person that everybody loved around the community. He just knew how to make people feel better.
And sir, you indicated, well, first you aware of where George Floyd went to school?
He went to school at Blackshear Elementary, and from Blackshear it was Ryan Middle School, and from Ryan it was Jack Yates High School, where he excelled in sports and basketball and football. He had received a scholarship to attend South Florida College, and from there he played basketball there, and he transferred to Texas A&M Kingsville, where he played football.
All right. Now, I'd like to show the witness Exhibit 285 for identification. Sir, do you recognize what's shown in Exhibit 285?
Yes, sir.
Is that a picture of your brother when he was at the Jack Yates High School in Houston?
Yes, sir.
Offer Exhibit 285.
Any objection? 285 is received.
And permission to publish.
So here's the.
All right, so here's an ad. I was actually gonna say, funny how they didn't say anything on the news about, him going to college and, him helping out around the house with his family, or, that he liked Nintendo. Like they tried really hard to let out all the bad stuff about his reputation come out, and we're just finding out all the good things about him. It's just really sad. And I'm really glad that I'm taking the time to watch the whole thing.
How old would George Floyd have been when this picture was taken?
It looked like 18 or 17 at that time.
And you talked about basketball and playing basketball. If I can show Exhibit 287 to the witness. 287. Thank you. All right, showing you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 287. Do you recognize this photo?
Yes, sir.
Is there a picture of your brother in this photo?
Yeah, he's number 5, South Florida, all the way in the left-hand corner.
All right, I'm going to offer Exhibit 287.
Any objection? 287 is received.
And permission to publish. All right, you indicated that your brother was number 5. Is that on the far left?
Yes, sir.
And South Florida, was that a community college?
South Florida was a community college. I'm looking at it. I noticed a whole bunch of the ball players because I met a lot of them coming up.
Did George Floyd maintain his level of fitness and love of basketball throughout his life?
Yes, sir. He loved to work out. He loved playing basketball. He loved teaching people the game of basketball. That's to me where I really learned how to play from him, because he guided a lot of guys on the court, showed them what they need to do to be better.
And when he would talk about playing basketball, would he use any particular term or phrase?
Oh, he said, "Hey man, let's go hooping," and we will always say, "Come on, let's go." We always went hooping, and you have to hoop every day, because if you don't go and shoot a whole bunch of shots, like 50 to 100 shots a day, my brother will always say, you'll never be able to compete. Hooping was big because Magic, you had to watch the stars. We watched Michael, we watched Magic, we watched everybody hoop every day.
And if you could take that down, you indicated that George Floyd was also interested in football, or had a passion for football. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Would he play catch with you?
He would play catch with us. It's funny how I always thought that my brother couldn't throw, but he never intended to throw the ball to me. He will always throw it at an angle where I have to go chase it and jump for it or dive for it. And I came up to him one day, I said, "Man," I said, "I see why you play tight end and stuff, because you can't throw it all." And he was like, "I don't want to throw the ball to you, because if I throw it to you, you'll never understand. You have to go get the ball." He said, "The ball should never come to you. You should always tell yourself, I'm going to go get the football, because you have to attack the ball." That's what he told me.
Sir, was your brother a father?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to show you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 290, just to the witness. Do you recognize what's shown in Exhibit 290?
Yes, sir.
Is that a picture of your brother with his daughter?
Yes, sir.
Offer Exhibit 290.
Any objection? 290 is received.
And permission to publish. And what's his daughter's name?
Gianna.
How old is she now?
7.
Sir, could you please, for the jury, describe George Floyd's relationship with his mother?
Oh, it was one of a kind. George, he would always be up on our mom. He was a big mama's boy. I cry a lot, but George, he loved his mom. He will always just be up on her. And, you know, every mother loves all of her kids, but it was so unique how they were with each other. He would lay up on her in the fetus position like he was still in a womb. I would see him every day, and I'd say, "Period." I'd say period because we called him Perry instead of George. And he would always say, "Hold on, let me kiss mama before I come over there." And being around him, he showed us like how to treat our mom and how to respect our mom. He loved her so dearly. And when George, he had found out that my mom was passing because she had to stay with us for hospice, and he was talking to her over the phone, but she perished before he even came down here. So that right there, it hurt him a lot. And when we went to the funeral, it's just, George just sat there at the casket over and over again. He would just say, "Mama, Mama," over and over again. And I didn't know what to tell him because I was in pain too. We all were hurting. And he was just kissing her and just kissing her. He didn't want to leave the casket. And everybody was like, come on, it's gonna be okay. But it was just difficult because I don't know who can take that when you watch your mother, somebody who loved and cherished you and nourished you for your entire life, and then they have to leave you. We all have to go through it, but it's difficult. And George, he was just in pain the entire time.
Sir, you indicated your mother passed away May 30. That was 2018. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you described seeing your brother George at the funeral. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And was around the time of your mother's passing the last time you saw your brother George Floyd in person alive?
Yes, sir.
Did you maintain contact with him on the phone, through text and whatnot after that?
Yeah, we text, we called each other. He would call and I would call him, but we would talk a lot of times early in the morning because I was a truck driver. So he will always be up talking to me and getting pointers on how to back up, how to do this, shifting gears, different things like that. And I had great teachers, so I would also just explain to him what he needed to do. And that level, to get to that next tier, that's what he would do. He would just listen. And he became a student. And I always had to ask him for advice because it was my big brother.
Sir, and this is a yes or no question. Were you informed that your brother George Floyd died on May 26, 2020?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so it looks like that was the entire testimony. That was really sad to see. It's very clear that he misses his brother and he loved and appreciated him during life. And it's good to see that at least, during life, he was getting love from his family members. George Floyd loved his mom, his brother. He took care of them, made sure they went to school. He was a Nintendo guy. We learned that he makes interesting combinations of food, which is okay. It's good to experiment with food. And yeah, I'm just really sad that we had to, that George Floyd had to go through what he did in order for the world to see him as who he really was when he was at home and with his family. And we saw that he was a father, and we saw a picture of him with his baby, and that was really sweet too to see. And it's just really sad that everything has come to this. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. The rest of this day we'll have experts on the stand. The first one's name is Jonathan Rich, and he is a cardiologist. And he's going to cover George Floyd's medical history before the incident on that day. So the video is called Derek Chauvin Trial, Cardiologist Testifies on George Floyd's Medical History, and that's going to be courtesy of 10 Tampa Bay.
So at that level, I felt pretty confident that Mr. Floyd had three medical problems. Number one, he had hypertension, high blood pressure. Number two, it appeared to me that he may have suffered from anxiety. And three, it looked like he also struggled with substance abuse.
Other than those three conditions, did Mr. Floyd have any diagnosis of heart disease while he was still alive?
No, he did not.
So you said you looked at the medical records not only for diagnoses of pre-existing conditions, but also for evidence of medical encounters?
Correct.
And by that you mean hospital visits, clinics, et cetera?
Emergency room visits, exactly.
What did you find in that regard?
So this is, in my opinion, was a really important part of the review as well, because every time Mr. Floyd had an encounter with a medical professional, I viewed that as an opportunity to see if there was any signs, symptoms whatsoever, even subtle, that could have indicated, for example, that he had anything going on with his heart. And so at the emergency room visits, he had one prolonged hospitalization. I really tried to take a look at everything. I looked at any opportunity I could to see if he ever complained of chest pain, which he did not, palpitations, which is a fluttering sensation of the heart. I reviewed all of the documented physical examinations of his heart to see if there were any abnormalities noted, and there were not. No murmurs, nothing found. I looked at all of his labs that get sent to see if there were any cardiac markers of injury, which he did not have. I reviewed his EKGs and his other tests. I tried to be as thorough as possible because I view what we do as a clinician in some ways as actually being a bit of a detective.
Our job is including the EKG. Did you note any cardiac problems that related to Mr. Floyd?
I noted no cardiac problems in the medical records as far as Mr. Floyd's medical condition was concerned, including everything I mentioned, the EKG, even a time where they put him on a continuous cardiac telemetry monitor, which they'll do sometimes just to see beat to beat if anything's going on. I reviewed that as well.
Did you see any evidence of Mr. Floyd having had any abnormal heart rhythms?
His EKG showed absolutely no abnormal heart rhythms. That cardiac telemetry that I...
Sorry about that, but my keyboard was about to run out of energy, so I needed to plug it in. But it sounds like George Floyd didn't have anything in his medical history that would have caused him to have problems that day. So that's something that we needed to know. Now we're going to continue on, and it's still going to be Dr. Jonathan Rich. This is titled, Dr. Jonathan Rich says repositioning George Floyd would have likely saved his life. And that's going to be courtesy of Fox 9, Minneapolis-St. Paul.
Then, taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us what that opinion is?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Were there critical points in time during his subdual and restraint on the ground when you feel measures could have or should have been taken that would have preserved his life?
Yes, I do. I think there were several junctures, actually.
Would you tell us about those?
Sure. Well, the first, of course, was to not subject him to that initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to. I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have died. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.
Any evidence?
Okay, so we just heard from the cardiologist say that if they would have just repositioned him. It could have saved his life. He did not need to die that day. We're going to go ahead and continue on. And the next video is called Dr. Jonathan Rich Says He's Confident Fentanyl Methamphetamine Did Not Play a Role in Floyd's Death. Hi, Emmanuel Briggs. How are you? This is going to be courtesy of Fox 9, Minneapolis-St. Paul.
At all that the primary cause of Mr. Floyd's death originated in his heart?
No, I did not.
Let's talk about a new subject. Whether or not Mr. Floyd suffered from a drug overdose and died from a drug overdose.
Okay.
That was something that you also considered as a cause.
Yes, sir.
Were you or are you familiar with Mr. Floyd's toxicology results?
Yes, I am.
What or which substances did you consider in evaluating Mr. Floyd's toxicology history?
When I looked at the toxicology reports, I focused mostly on the finding of fentanyl as well as the finding of methamphetamines.
What role, if any, do you feel that the fentanyl played in the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
As far as I can tell from reviewing all of the facts of the case, I see no evidence at all to suggest that a fentanyl overdose caused Mr. Floyd's death.
As a cardiologist, do you occasionally have to care for patients who struggle with opioids or opioid addiction?
Absolutely.
So here you found that the fentanyl, in your opinion, played no role in Mr. Floyd's death. Would you tell us why it is you hold that opinion? How do you reach that conclusion?
Well, I think I would break it down to just two major reasonings. Number one, it appeared to me that Mr. Floyd, who was an acknowledged frequent chronic user of substances, particularly opiates, likely developed a high degree of tolerance. There's even one emergency room visit that I had reviewed where he came in and he told the emergency room team that, he was tearful and says, I'm having trouble with substance abuse. I think he said I took 8 Percocets within 2 hours. He had no side effects from that at all. They observed him for a couple hours and they discharged him. And just so looking through, it looked like he had built up a high tolerance just in general to opiates. But the second, and just as important, maybe more important, was I didn't see any of the signs of an opiate overdose when I reviewed the videos.
And when you then are referring to the signs of an opiate overdose, would you tell the jurors or describe for them what are those signs and what didn't you see?
Sure. So in my experience in the intensive care unit, taking care of patients who come in with an opiate overdose, first of all, they are usually extremely lethargic, oftentimes nearly unarousable. And then you try to wake them up and they're falling right back asleep. They're not talking to you. If they are talking to you, they're often having slurred speech. If they're standing up, which they wouldn't be if they had a fentanyl intoxication and overdose, they would have to imagine get pretty dizzy pretty quickly. I kind of saw all the opposite with Mr. Floyd. I saw that he was alert, he was awake, he was conversant, he was walking, and yet, according to the toxicology report, he had this degree of fentanyl in his system. So just looking at the clinical story, I didn't see any signs or symptoms of fentanyl overdose.
Let's turn to methamphetamine then. What role do you feel that methamphetamine played in Mr. Floyd's cause of death?
I feel it played no substantive role at all.
And why is that?
Well, all considering, it was very relatively low level of methamphetamine in his system. And so when you look at the context of the case and you see a relatively low level of methamphetamine in the context of everything else, I felt very confident that that low degree of methamphetamine was not what was triggering this profound cardiopulmonary arrest and ultimately PEA arrest.
Right, so you heard it straight from the cardiologist. There was no sign of any kind of overdose in his autopsy or toxicology reports and things like that. And I was just thinking to myself too, if that had to be something that the defense came up with after the fact as an excuse for George Floyd's death, because in that case, well, if Derek Chauvin thought that was happening while he was arresting George Floyd and had his knee on his neck, why wasn't that a reason to get his knee off of his neck and get him some help, right? But it's all a bunch of BS, and we all know it. Everybody has a role to do in the situation. We're going to go ahead and continue on, and the cardiologist is still going to be on the stand. It's called Cardiologist says George Floyd did not die from primary cardiac event or a drug overdose. So this man here is basically erasing and negating everything that the defense says allegedly was the cause of George Floyd's death. He's doing it right now. And this is going to be courtesy of MSNBC.
You're a reactor, a mover.
That's going to be an ad, so let me just go ahead and, I can't skip through it, but I'll just pick up the volume when the video starts.
To your opinion, cardiopulmonary arrest caused by low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. What caused the low level of oxygen in the case of Mr. George Floyd?
Well, in his case, it was truly the prone restraint and positional restraints that led to his asphyxiation. In a nutshell, he was just simply unable, using all of his muscles of respiration, his chest wall, what we call accessory muscles of respiration, which are extra muscles that will be triggered in the event that you're having trouble breathing. He was trying to get in enough oxygen, and because he was unable to, because of the position that he was subjected to, as we just discussed, the heart thus didn't have enough oxygen either, which then means the entire body is deprived of oxygen.
So low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. Did you consider other possible causes for Mr. Floyd's death?
Sure. I tried, of course, to be as thorough as possible, but I focused mostly on two other potential causes. Number one is whether there could have been a primary heart contribution to George Floyd's death. And the second was whether a drug overdose could have caused his death.
So, doctor, would you tell the jury what is a primary heart event?
Sure. So a lot of things can injure the heart. For example, if you do not take in enough oxygen, that will injure all the organs, including the heart. When I use the term a primary heart event, I mean something that originated from the heart itself. So for example, a heart attack. All right, one of the arteries of the heart just suddenly got blocked completely and a heart attack occurred. Or the heart just, without any explanation, nothing else secondary inducing it, went into a serious ventricular arrhythmia. Okay, so the bottom part of the heart, that part that we were talking about that needs to pump blood to the body, suddenly went into a chaotic rhythm all on its own. If any of those things happened, then I would consider that a primary heart issue, not being caused or secondary to something else.
So you considered whether or not Mr. Floyd might have passed away from a primary heart event or a drug overdose. Did you reach an opinion or conclusion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether either of those two causes explain Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us your opinion?
Sure. After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Thank you, Dr. Rich. Would you tell us what evidence or facts, documents, what did you look at to help you to reach that conclusion about
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rich, for clearing that up for anybody who had any questions about George Floyd's medical condition before the event and also how much drugs he had in his system. It sounds like George Floyd was a bit of, he had made a habit of taking pills. So he had developed not an immunity, but he was just, not as affected by a little amount. And then last week we saw that there was some pills left in the cop car, and apparently some of them were chewed up. So he had taken some, but it wasn't enough to cause his death. And that's what we heard from the cardiologist, who's going to continue taking the stand. I've got, I think, 2 more videos with him. And then the next person on the stand will be a USC law professor. But let's continue on with this next video. It's called Cardiologist Dr. Jonathan Rich Gives Opinion and Cause of George Floyd's Death, just in case anybody had any questions. That's going to be courtesy of Fox 9, Minneapolis-St. Paul.
You did. What did you review before forming opinions in the case?
Sure. So I was provided with a lot of evidence to look through, but mostly I looked through the medical records, interviews, all the videos that were provided to me, and the autopsy report.
Did you review some journal articles as well?
Yeah, as I was formulating my opinion and creating my expert report, I also looked up journal articles and embedded them into my report for references.
Have you formed any opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Would you tell us your opinion or opinions?
Sure. In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from a cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to.
Okay, that was right on time. Just give me 1 second. I'm still kind of new with this program. I just wanted to share a different screen here. So let me stop screen here. Hi everyone, and let me share a different screen. It's going to be a Chrome tab and Kim Potter, and there's no audio, so share. So you guys should be seeing the same thing I'm looking at right now, and it looks like Kim Potter, who is the former police officer involved in the new shooting. I forgot his name. Dante Wright. Sorry, it just happens so often. And this looks to be her mugshot. I mean, it's got to be, right? She's a cop. She shouldn't already have one. So it's official. She's charged, and it's going to be, it looks like, oh wait, you guys can't see it. It's switched over to a new tab. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. So stop screen and then share again, share screen, Chrome tab, and it's going to be that. So now you guys should be able to see her mugshot. Okay, and it looks like Kim Potter will be charged with manslaughter. So far, that's what they have for her in the fatal shooting of Dante Wright. So that's just an update for the newest events that we have going on right now. So let's go ahead and continue on with our court. Share audio, and that should bring us back. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to watch is Derek Chauvin trial. Defense cross-examines cardiologist, and this is going to be courtesy of 10 Tampa Bay.
Mr. Floyd, based on your review of the video, did start complaining of shortness of breath prior to being placed in the prone position, right?
Yes, I heard on more than one occasion he say the words, "I can't breathe."
And if Mr. Floyd had simply gotten in the back seat of the squad car, do you think that he would have survived?
Check, Your Honor. I call for medical testimony.
You may give if you have a medical opinion as to that.
Overruled to that extent.
So had he not been restrained in the way in which he was, I think he would have survived that day. I think he would have gone home or wherever he was going to go had he not been subjected to the prone and positional restraint that he was.
So in other words, if he had gotten in the squad car, he'd be alive.
I think my answer remains the same. Anything other than that scenario that he was subjected to, I have no reason to think from a medical perspective that he would not have survived that day, correct?
And in terms of the prone position, you would agree that the prone position is not in and of itself inherently dangerous.
In an ordinary individual, if we were to take away everything else that was going on and someone was just simply lying in the prone position, while there are many patients who that would be inherently dangerous, the average individual, I would agree with you, probably just lying flat in that situation generally wouldn't be dangerous.
Even in the ICU, there are circumstances where people have serious medical conditions where they're maintained in the prone position. Agreed?
In the ICU, when patients are put into the prone position, it is when it is a desperate attempt to save someone's life where their lungs have actually developed what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. They have a ventilator in to make sure that the amount of air that they get, no matter their positioning, will always be enough. And so it's a funny thing to think about putting someone in the prone positioning in the ICU on a respirator, but because of respiratory physiology, sometimes that will actually help open up certain segments of the lungs that are needed for oxygenation. But it's really important to keep in mind that they are on a respirator every single time to open up those lung airways, and they're usually on sedation as well to keep them comfortable.
And my last question, doctor, is after someone's heart stops, is it possible that they continue to respire?
It is, well, I'm not sure I could answer that with certainty other than to say there are these things that are called agonal breaths. So when I'm in the intensive care unit with a patient who is dying and they go into cardiac arrest, once in a while you will see them take one or two extra breaths. I'm not sure the exact mechanism or the physiologic trigger for that. So you could potentially see some extra breaths for a short period of time.
By a short period of time, up to a minute?
In my experience, if the heart has completely stopped, I would not expect to see the breathing continue for up to a minute, but I might expect it to be seen for several seconds.
Okay, so I have, and that's going to be it for Dr. Jonathan Rich. And next up, we have USC law professor testifies at Floyd trial, and this is going to be courtesy of News 19 WLTX. Don't mind my dog. Let's play.
Making headlines today, one of the witnesses who testified was in the Chauvin trial was University of South Carolina law professor Seth Stoughton. He teaches several classes at USC and is an author on topics of police use of force. His career includes a period of time as a police officer with the Tallahassee, Florida Police Department. During testimony, he talked about the position officers put Floyd in and why it wasn't appropriate.
At that point, was it necessary for the officers to prone him?
No, it was not.
Why not?
Again, looking at the threat analysis here, it's clear from the number of officers and Mr. Floyd's position, the fact that he's handcuffed and has been searched, he doesn't present a threat of harm. His actions don't indicate that he presents any threat of escape. And as he's saying thank you for being taken out of the backseat of the car, it would certainly suggest that the point of conflict that had provoked his resistance in the first place is over. It suggests a lack of intention. Given the range of other alternatives available to the officers, it's just not appropriate to prone someone who is at that point cooperative.
What is the purpose of placing someone in the prone position in accordance with generally accepted police standards?
Yes, the prone position is a very useful position in policing for getting control of someone for purposes of handcuffing them. Again, the prone position is just basically face down, right? Their chest, front of the hips on the ground. When officers are struggling with someone, or when they're handcuffing someone who they anticipate struggling with, you'll often see officers put someone into that prone position for purposes of handcuffing, because it's very difficult for someone to fight or to resist as they're face down on the ground, especially once their arms are out at their sides. However, the prone position, as useful as it is for handcuffing, is supposed to be transitory. It's used for handcuffing, and then as soon as someone has been handcuffed, you take them out of that position for, I imagine, reasons that we'll discuss.
And the position that you take him out of and put him into, is that the side recovery position?
It is, yes.
If you could then, just recalling the clip we saw initially when Mr. Floyd was on his knees and he was brought to the ground, what position was he in initially?
So initially, as he's on his knees, when he's brought over onto his left side, that would be consistent with the recovery position, laying on his side with his legs either straight or bent.
And then from that, essentially what would be the side recovery position, he was actually brought into the prone position from the recovery position. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I just need a moment to update one of my, no, I want to edit it. One of my banner things. So it's going to be 2nd-degree manslaughter for Kim Porter. Let's be consistent with our information and show that. All right, so let's continue on with the next video, and it's going to be use of force expert. Floyd does not appear to have intent to assault or attack officers, and this is courtesy of MSNBC. So here we have more people saying that it didn't have to be taken as far as it did that day. So let's just continue on, and then after Seth Stoughton, I have basically like a wrap up of the day for anybody who's just coming in, you know, and or been in and out and missing things. So you at least get like the key takeaways from day 11, and then I'll try to gather the clips from day 12 and show that either in a little bit or maybe later tonight. Sometimes I, can't sleep at night, so I might just decide to go live at 3 in the morning. You never know what could happen. So make sure you hit the notification bell so you don't, miss a single moment. So let's continue on with the next video.
Here's a song about a brawny paper towel.
The time that he was placed prone, when this use of force was done, was Mr. Floyd a threat?
So again, threat is specific, but I don't see him presenting a threat of anything. He was not a threat of harm to the officers, even to the extent he had physical ability. He didn't have much in the way of opportunity to assault or harm the officers. And just as importantly, there's no specific and articulable facts that a reasonable officer in the defendant's position could use to conclude that he had the intention of causing physical harm to the officers or others. It's very clear that although he had legs, so I suppose he had the physical ability to run away, he does not have the opportunity to do so. And again, there's no facts from which we could assess any intention to escape, so no threat of escape. And really, in light of the situation, there's not even a credible threat of obstructing the investigation. with 4 officers in the immediate area and one more, I believe a park police officer, maybe half a block away across the street. There are ample resources on scene to maintain control and custody of Mr. Floyd. 2 officers can stand with him, and the other 2 can go about doing the what was ultimately a forgery investigation.
That's exactly right, but instead they took it too far. Let's continue on to the next video. We have 7 left total, and it's going to be Derek Chauvin trial. Use of force expert Seth Stoughton testifies, and that's courtesy of Kare 11.
And I'd like you to now please share with the jury what conclusions that you have reached regarding the use of force by the defendant on Mr. Floyd. So I'll ask you first, you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether the type of force used by the defendant on George Floyd on May 25, 2020 constituted deadly force.
I do, yes.
And what is that opinion?
That it did. The use of force had the foreseeable effect and a substantial likelihood of resulting in death or great bodily harm.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether the type of force used by the defendant on George Floyd on May 25, 2020 was reasonable as viewed by a reasonable police officer on the scene?
I do have such an opinion, yes.
What is that opinion?
Both the knee across Mr. Floyd's neck and the prone restraint were unreasonable, excessive, and contrary to generally accepted police practices.
When, in your opinion, did the unreasonable force begin?
When Mr. Floyd was initially put into the prone restraint position and when the defendant's knee was placed onto his neck.
And when did it end?
When the defendant's knee was lifted off of Mr. Floyd and he was taken out of the prone restraint position.
Do you have an opinion to a degree of reasonable professional certainty as to whether defendant's use of force whereby he restrained Mr. Floyd in that prone position for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25, 2020 was reasonable as viewed by a reasonable police officer on the scene?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
No reasonable officer would have believed that that was an appropriate, acceptable, or reasonable use of force.
And was the force, was the force unreasonable as it started and as it ended?
From the time it was initiated and throughout its duration, yes.
You heard that. No reasonable officer, which is probably what they're going to say about Kim Potter if it goes to trial. They're going to say no reasonable officer mistakes their gun for a taser. And that's just what I think, but we'll see where that one goes to. Let's continue on to the next video. It's Seth Stoughton, use of force expert, testifies in Derek Chauvin trial. This isn't the one that I just showed, is it? Hang on, let me see something real quick. No, they're called the same thing.
Period was over, is that right? And the paramedics had arrived?
Yes, it did. And as we discussed, as you're evaluating use of force, you look at the facts and circumstances as they existed at the time, which means you can't consider events that occurred later after the use of force is concluded to justify earlier use of force.
In your analysis, did the bystanders present a threat during the restraint period?
No, they did not present a threat to the officers.
And it's judged by a reasonable officer on the scene in the defendant's position. Would a reasonable officer have perceived them as a threat?
No, the facts and circumstances suggest not. For example, Officer Tao did not interpose himself between the bystanders and the other officers until more than 6 minutes into the prone restraint period. His communications with the crowd were, as discussed, when individual bystanders stepped into the street and were directed back up onto the curb. With one exception, they did so within a few seconds without any type of physical contact. When there was physical contact between Officer Tao and one of the bystanders who looked like an older child or a young boy, that bystander was swiftly grabbed and pulled away by another one of the bystanders.
Now, did you see the defendant interact in or with or in the area of any of the bystanders after the restraint period was over?
After the restraint period was over, yes, the defendant left the position where he had been during the restraint and walked back, I believe, to his squad, the police vehicle, walking by several of the bystanders, not really interacting with them, but just walking by them or near them. And then once in his vehicle, he interacted with, I believe, the same bystander we had discussed earlier, Charlie McMillan. Charles.
All right, so that wasn't the same video, but I feel like I'm getting deja vu with some of these titles, so that's why I'm getting confused. But let's continue on. The next video is Derek Chauvin trial. A use of force expert says he counted George Floyd say, "I can't breathe," 27 times. And this is going to be courtesy of 10 Tampa Bay.
And did you hear Mr. Floyd say plainly that he was experiencing some form of medical distress?
Not only does he indicate it with the words he's using, saying that he can't breathe, but even compared to that prior clip, his voice is slower and thicker. So both what he is saying and how he is saying it would indicate an increased medical distress.
And would a reasonable officer on the scene then, hearing this, have at least been aware of the complaint?
Absolutely, especially when you hear an officer responded to that complaint, it's certainly an indication that an officer was aware of it.
Okay. And you reviewed these body-worn cameras on numerous occasions, is that right?
Yes, many times.
Did you have an opportunity to review body-worn camera in which the defendant's voice could be heard at the same time that you could see him as the speaker?
I believe there is, yes, he is identifiable as the speaker. I forget which body-worn camera that is, or maybe it's the comparison of multiple body-worn cameras, but he is identifiable as the speaker there.
And I'm sorry, and in the exchange we just heard, was he identifiable as the speaker who was saying, uh-huh?
Yes.
That Mr. Floyd had said, "I can't breathe," approximately 27 times. Is that the incessant speech you were talking about?
Yes. Before he fell silent, Mr. Floyd said, "I can't breathe," by my count, at least 27 times.
27 times and was taken seriously 0 times. But that's why we're here. So the next video is called Defense Attorney Eric Nelson Cross-Examines Seth Stoughton Use of Force Expert. And this is going to be courtesy of Fox 9 Minneapolis-St. Paul.
And Brian.
No, we're going to not listen to that. It's just a few seconds and then I'll play the video here, but that sounded crazy.
Be free.
In your review of the reasonableness of the use of force, it was unreasonable for the officers to put Mr. Floyd in the prone position at all, period, correct?
Yes. At that point, he did not present a threat to the officers or their interests. He did not present a threat of escape. The officers used some amount of force to put him into the car, and I have no issue with that. But putting him in the prone position, especially on the street side of the car, was unreasonable and excessive and contrary to generally accepted police practices.
Reasonable minds can disagree, agreed?
On this particular point, no.
Okay, so Sergeant Steiger, who testified earlier, did you have an opportunity to review his testimony?
I believe yes, I did.
And so his assessment that it was reasonable for the officers to use the prone position in that time, at that time, you would disagree with him?
I disagree. I think putting someone prone is unreasonable there. They are already handcuffed. The prone position is a transitory position used to restrain someone, handcuffs, or I suppose hobbles. In this case, officers took Mr. Floyd out of the car, put him on his knees, and then put him onto his side. And again, if they had stopped there, I would not have any quibble with their actions.
Now, You testified that you described the prone position as transitory in nature.
It is, yes, for 30 years or so, it's been generally accepted that that is a transitory position for the purposes of handcuffing or securing.
Are there ever situations where officers would keep a person in the prone position longer than a transitory nature?
There shouldn't be. The putting someone in the recovery position is literally a matter of rotating them 90 degrees onto their side. Officers can maintain as much or almost as much control over the individual. So while I suppose it's hypothetically possible, you know, if there's, I don't know, if gunfire breaks out and the officers are laying on someone to protect them with their body, maybe, but certainly not in this case.
So in your academic endeavors, you submitted a opinion piece to the Washington Post. Do you recall that?
Specific to this case, I don't know, close to 30 op-eds at this point. So
on May 29th of 2020, an article appeared in the Washington Post authored by Seth Stoughton. That's you, right?
Stoughton, but
Stoughton,
yes.
sorry.
That's all right.
Jeffrey Noble, that's the person you wrote the book with, right?
Yes, one of the two individuals.
Yep. And Jeffrey Alpert, right?
The other co-author of the book, yes.
And so you wrote officers might need to hold someone down in the prone position, but they should do so by putting their shin across the subject's upper back, not the neck. Do you disagree with that?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Overruled. Are you asking me if I wrote that?
Correct.
I did, yes, referring to handcuffing.
Pressing on someone's neck risks damaging the cervical spine or breaking the hyoid bone, which can be fatal.
Yes.
And this was an opinion that you had formulated. Your opinion piece was from 4 days after this incident?
That, yes, it was based on the review, as I think I write in the first or second paragraph of the opinion, the limited information that was available at that time.
Right. And so at that point, it's fair to say that you had already formed the opinion based on that limited information that this was an unreasonable use of force.
I think it's fair to say that I had formed the opinion that putting your knee across someone's neck, except in absolutely unbelievably rare circumstances, is generally an inappropriate use of force. This is an application of that generally accepted practice. Of course, as I reviewed all of the materials in this case, some of the opinions that I discussed at the bottom of that op-ed changed, and this was not one of them. The additional information confirmed that the knee across the neck was inappropriate and that the prone restraint was inappropriate.
Was the knee, in your opinion, across the neck throughout the entire 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
From my perspective, that's irrelevant. The knee should never be on the neck. It was certainly on the neck for a majority of the time, even if it was moved off of the neck at certain points.
All right, well, defense attorney is shook.
The police use of force.
Sorry, but so far he hasn't been able to change anybody's mind, especially not mine. I haven't seen anybody like backtrack or, go back from what they originally said, due to any kind of influence that he's had so far. The only person that I saw kind of change what they said was one police officer. I think he might have been like an expert. I'm not too sure. He was an expert, but I think he was a police officer. And he was the one that said that George Floyd at one point said, I ain't do no drugs. And then he changed it to like, I ate too many drugs, or like switched around. And even then, I didn't think that made too much of a difference in this case. The witnesses so far today have stuck in their heels, and they're sticking with it. And that was that the use of force was not necessary and, in fact, improper procedure. So I think we're looking forward to a guilty verdict. I just don't want anybody to get their hopes up, because sentencing is sometimes disappointing. So we got to prepare ourselves emotionally for that, and also for everything that is to come afterwards, especially in light of the Dante Wright shooting. Crown Empress says, so Derek Chauvin's girlfriend was Dante Wright's teacher once. Okay, that's a big coincidence, and I personally don't believe in coincidences. That's crazy. I mean, is it possible that it's like a small area, kind of a place where everybody knows each other, or if not, like, you know, everybody's parents know each other, kind of a thing? Because I live in a really small area and everybody knows each other, it feels like, down here. So, I mean, it could be a coincidence. No, George's girlfriend, my bad. George Floyd's girlfriend. I think that's what you put. But okay, let's continue on. I really hope that I think I erased the last one, so this should be the next one. It's called Derek Chauvin Trial Defense Cross-Examines Use of Force Expert, and that's going to be courtesy of 10 Tampa Bay.
The police use of force is never a particularly attractive thing to watch or to witness.
It's not very pretty. I think that's often the case.
Right. And just because it's not very pretty does not mean that it's not lawful use of force. Agreed?
Yes, sure. An officer.
And I also wanted to mention something real quick, and I keep forgetting to mention it, is didn't they say too that George Floyd and Derek Chauvin worked together at the same like club or something like that? Nobody is gonna, ask about that. No one's gonna take the stand and talk about, whether or not they knew each other or anything like that. Was it not relevant? Because I was kind of listening out for more information on that to see if it was true or not. So yeah.
Can act reasonably and consistent with generally accepted police practices, and it can look bad. As I said, I don't think that's the case here. There is a significant difference between the positioning and the techniques of getting someone into handcuffs, and then the techniques and tactics of maintaining control of someone once they've been handcuffed. So if that's what you're asking, yes, the actions that an officer takes while handcuffing someone are not necessarily justified after the individual has been handcuffed. Yes, and officers can do a range of things to mitigate risk and to prevent it from becoming becoming a threat. They can't use force to address risk.
Okay, so I think that's going to be the last video as far as people taking the stand. Let me check my banners real quick. Let's do the breaking news because that's important. And we'll hide this one. Okay, let's see. The next video is going to be Derek Chauvin Trial Day 11 update, and this is basically a summary of what we just saw. The upside about looking at news clips is obviously it's a lot faster, but the downside is that there's a lot of stuff that we're not going to get to hear, like some of the little bits that get said before the judge withdraws it and stuff like that. We didn't get to see any of that, but this is faster, and I think we're getting the most information this way. But as soon as I get that subscription with StreamYards, I'll just play it by ear and then decide if I want to do like a whole court date or just do clips and then go from there. So let's go ahead and just look at this update real quick from day 11, and then I have one more video.
3 witnesses testified in day 11 of the Derek Chauvin trial. Here are the top 3 things you need to know. Number 1, expert witness Dr. Jonathan Rich, a cardiologist, disagreed with the defense about what killed George Floyd.
George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Number 2, we heard from George Floyd's younger brother, Philones Floyd. It's the first time a family member has spoken in court, and he painted a picture of the kind of older brother Floyd was.
He was so much of a leader to us in the household. He will always make sure that we had our clothes for school. He made sure that we all were going to be to school on time. He just was like a person that everybody loved around the community.
Number 3, the state asked Seth Stoughton, a criminal law professor and use of force expert, to give his opinion on the actions of former Officer Chauvin.
Both the knee across Mr. Floyd's neck and the prone restraint were unreasonable, excessive, and contrary to generally accepted police practices.
All right, we're almost done here. We got one more video to go. It's called Derek Chauvin Trial Continues as the defense team presents their case. And I want to say that I grabbed this from yesterday, so it's probably going to be a preview of day 12.
Well, also in Minneapolis, the prosecution team in the Derek Chauvin trial rested this morning, and the defense team started presenting its case today. They're arguing that it wasn't Chauvin's knee that killed George Floyd, but outside factors. They called officers and a paramedic to the witness stand. The defense focused on Floyd's health and drug use.
He told me that he had been taking multiple, like every 20 minutes.
I felt that Derek Chauvin was justified and was acting with objective reasonableness following Minneapolis Police Department policy.
The defense team also arguing that a growing crowd was hostile, a potential threat, and a distraction to Chauvin the day Floyd died. So far, the defense is moving at a much faster pace, and it's expected they could rest and put the case in the hands of the jury by this weekend.
All right, so that was 3 weeks of court instead of the expected 4 weeks. So let's delete that off our docket, and I'm going to go ahead and say thank you very much for stopping by, and I will see you all tonight at Crown Empress. I might go live if I'm able to grab the clips that I need for day 12. I'll go ahead and try to go live before that. If not, then maybe later tonight. I'm not too sure. I'm just going to play it by ear. But thank you so much for stopping by. Please remember to hit the like, and I will see you all soon. Bye.